on to John chapter 12. John has a certain cadence to it. John's book starts with a description of who the Logos is and how he came from the Father, made his dwelling among us, and lived among men. So he came from the Father. The book then is a story about a number of things Jesus did to manifest himself as being sent from the Father. And then at the end of the book he says, and now where I'm going, you can't come with me, I'm going back to my Father. And so you have sort of a U. He comes down from the Father, dwells among his disciples, and then goes back into heaven. We find ourselves at sort of a transition point in John chapter 12 today as Jesus turns from his public ministry of signs, and that section of the book in chapters 2 to 12 is very frequently by scholars referred to as the book of signs. The word sign is a theological biblical term that refers to some often miraculous but certainly divinely ordained moments by which God reveals himself to his people. There were 7 signs that are mentioned in the book of John, some say 8. And they all had a particular purpose, because John has a purpose, and that is so that people might believe that he's the Son of God, that he's the Messiah. Those signs were to be a help along the way, but they weren't always a help, were they? In fact, we're going to talk about that today. What about when the signs, if I can put it this way, don't work, and what's going on? We're going to close out, if you will, the book of signs today, because we're going to be moving into chapter 13. Jesus is going to turn his attention away from the crowds, away from the world, and away from the Jews and the Jewish leaders, and turn his attention to the 12 disciples to prepare them for the time when he will go to his Father and when they'll take this project and take this mission to the world. So it's very much an important passage, but it's clearly transitional. No one has really missed that. And it starts in verse 37 when John says this. He says, even though he'd performed so many signs in their presence, they did not believe in him. That's the transition. By the way, we haven't seen a sign in the outlay of John's literature since chapter 11. It's not like in the immediate context he had just done another sign. John is just summarizing what happened with these 7 signs, and you remember them. We're told specifically in chapter 2 that the first of the signs that were to happen was the turning of the water into wine. Then Jesus heals the royal official's son in Capernaum in chapter 4. He heals a paralyzed man at Bethsaida in chapter 5. He feeds the 5,000 in chapter 6. He walks on the water in chapter 6. He heals a man born blind from birth in chapter 9, which really heats things up. And then ultimately he raises Lazarus from the dead. All the testimony and all the kicking up of the sand, if you will, the stirring of things in Jerusalem because of the raising of Lazarus really gets the religious leaders upset and wanting to do something about the person of Jesus. Well, we've got a lot of passage to cover. We're going to take this all the way to verse 50 from 37 today, but we'll do it a chunk at a time. I'll have a very brief outline behind me on the screen, and the first thing we're going to see is how Jesus closes the book on this work that he had trying to convince the Jewish people around him. It's an interesting passage that Ben read yesterday where some Greeks came up saying, we want to see Jesus. Jesus doesn't respond to him at all. Instead, he says, okay, the hour has come now for the Son of Man to be glorified, because this message is going to go global. World history is going to change. And I can't help but think Jesus sees it in the eyes of these Greeks who say, we want to meet this Jesus guy. This is all very, very transitional. John, looking at what's been going on, says, Jesus did a lot of things. In fact, in the end of the book, he says, there's a lot more than is written in my book. It almost seems like John is wanting to fill in some of the gaps that weren't covered by Matthew, Mark, and Luke and fill out a story that had already been told. But even at the end of his story, John says there's even more than this. But in spite of all the things that Jesus did, people still didn't believe. What is the final word on the Jews? Well, John is dealing with what D.A. Carson colorfully refers to as large-scale catastrophic unbelief on the part of his audience. The things that he did weren't being denied necessarily. Most of the time they weren't denying him. There wasn't somebody coming along going, come on, you weren't blind. Because they knew the guy. He'd been there for 38 years. Everybody knew the guy. You couldn't go, you were faking it for 38 years. That wasn't happening. The problem wasn't that people were failing to believe the signs. There was something else going on. And the way that John deals with it is to reach back to Isaiah 700 years before his own time. Verse 38. This was to fulfill the word of Isaiah the prophet, who said in chapter 53 of Isaiah, Lord, who has believed our message? And to whom has the arm of the Lord been revealed? Isaiah there, speaking about the same large-scale catastrophic unbelief of God's covenant people, bemoans the fact that God had revealed himself. And that's, by the way, what the arm of the Lord is. It's the act of God by which he supernaturally reveals and manifests himself to his people. And in spite of everything he did in their history, there was this almost impermeable and committed unbelief on the part of the Jewish people. And what John is saying is that this is a repeat. By the way, John's not going to be the only one to see that. We're going to see that all the way through the New Testament. We'll talk about that in a moment. Isaiah 53 is a very important passage, of course, because it is messianic. And it's very very widely recognized as messianic even at this time. And if you read through Isaiah 53, you see all of these allusions to the Messiah who would come and to his redemptive work. But he just pulls this one statement out. God revealed himself to his people, but they simply would not believe. He doesn't stop there. In verse 39, he says, this is why they were unable to believe. We'll talk about the inability to believe in a moment, but I just want to talk about this refusal to believe right now in the face of signs. By the way, it says in verse 37, even though he'd performed all these signs, they still did not believe in him. And what does that tell you? It tells you the purpose of the signs. The purpose of the signs was not to wow the crowds. The purpose of the signs was to convince those who were seeing the miracles and the signs that what Jesus had to say was true. It was to affirm both the message and the speaker, in this case being Jesus himself. By the way, you can read this in other places too. If you look at Hebrews chapter 2, it tells us that the purpose of miraculous signs was to confirm Jesus, and then ultimately, as they were repeated in the work of the apostles, to confirm the message of the apostles too. It was never the case that miraculous events were there just to titillate or to wow or to move or to emotionally, charge or electrify an audience. In spite of the way those things are purportedly used today, by, evangelical carnivalists. That was not what was going on in the life of Jesus. Jesus' message was never separated from, his miracles were never separated from his claims and from his gospel and from his message about the kingdom. So what John is telling us here is that in spite of what they saw, very much like the Jews of old, they simply refused to believe. There was a committed refusal to believe. I want to talk about belief, at least in so much as John does, all the way down to verse 43, because it's something that we face. I mean, you experience sometimes doubts, don't you? This is a huge subject, and it's not even in my notes. I don't know why I'm going here, but belief can be a hard thing, especially in a culture of skepticism and doubt. And we, Christians, carry these incredible beliefs along with us and find ourselves sometimes assaulted with these little attacks of doubt, no doubt, launched at us by the enemy. But let me suggest something that I'm not talking about doubt. Doubt is not the same thing as unbelief. John's not talking about doubt. He's not talking about questions. He's not talking about uncertainties. He's not talking about little gaps in your belief system. He's talking about abject and committed unbelief. That's a whole different thing. Someone was telling me recently about a question that was put to somebody. I can't even remember the context. It was in a debate format, and the person who was doing the debate asked the person who came to the microphone, I want to ask you a question. If I were to give you absolute proof that the gospel was true, that you couldn't deny, would you believe then? And the answer was no. You've got something more going on there than analytical thinking. You've got something more going on there than evidence. You have the committed metaphysical disposition of a heart that is entrenched in darkness and unbelief. It's a commitment at that point. And this is really what John is saying here. He's saying nobody was denying the miracles. Nobody was denying what Jesus was doing. They were just denying his claim to sonship. They were denying that he was from the Father. They weren't denying that he was doing the miracles. They never connected the dots. There was here, first of all, a refusal to believe. Second, there was this inability to believe. This is why, verse 39, they were unable to believe. Look, don't look for me to explain all this. Well, let me just say that going in. This is why they were unable to believe, because Isaiah also said, he's blinded their eyes and hardened their hearts so they would not see with their eyes or understand with their hearts and turn and I would heal them. And that reference actually is to Isaiah's personal commission into ministry. You remember in chapter 6 of Isaiah, there was this incredible vision where Isaiah sees the Lord high and lifted up, and his train fills the temple, his glory fills the temple, and there's this experience that he has of God's presence that frankly outperforms his ability to put it into words. And he does the best that he can. And being overwhelmed by the moment, a number of things happen in the discussion, but ultimately he says to the Lord who asks, who will go for us to represent the holy God to this people? And Isaiah says, I'll do it, send me. And our passage that's quoted by John comes now. He says, okay, you can go, but he says this, go and say to these people, keep listening, but do not understand. Keep looking, but do not perceive. You will make the minds of these people dull, deafen their ears, and blind their eyes. Otherwise, they might see with their eyes and hear with their ears and understand with their minds and turn back and be healed. Wow, what an introduction into ministry. And so Isaiah says, okay, so how long is this going to last? And he says, until the cities lie in ruins without inhabitants and the houses are without people. They're not going to listen. They're going into judgment. They're not going to listen. What God says to Isaiah is, Isaiah, look, you're going to go into this ministry, but you need to know something. Their unbelief is committed. Sound familiar to anybody? I think we find ourselves in a similar context. He says they're not going to turn back. And it's a funny thing about light that's given. Light that's given to a dark heart eventually turns the heart hard. It's still light. It's still truth. It's still a genuine offer to believe. But John is saying, look, what's happening now and what happened in the life of Jesus through all these signs that he did is something that happened in the past with the people who were committed to self-promotion and dark unbelief. It's the same thing. In fact, this is a theme that scholars note. They call it the theme of obduracy. It's not a word that we use very much, but it speaks of a hard heart. Presents itself here in this context, but it comes up in other places as well. They were unable to believe. You see, the light that's rejected has a hardening effect in time on the heart. And Isaiah was commissioned to go where the light would be given and given and given throughout his life, but it would be rejected. And John here is speaking of the effect of the ministry of light giving that hardens the heart that will not receive. Well, and we got to be careful. We don't know who that is. I don't know who it is. I know a lot of people are going to reject, but I still give the light. And the rest of it is up to God. And you know what's talked about here in this passage is a blindness. And this issue of blindness comes up. Paul mentions it. Jesus talks about it. It's all through the New Testament, through the epistles. It's one of the themes of John, light and darkness. What is this darkness and what is the blindness he's talking about? To some degree, and the reference to this passage reminds us that John's talking about a judicial blindness. He's talking about a blindness that comes in the context of this incorrigible commitment to reject any light and any evidence and any truth and any history and any testimony and any story because I already have a religious or a metaphysical commitment. It's a hard place to preach. By the way, this same passage, this Isaiah 6 passage, the commission of Isaiah, it comes up a number of places. The synoptics, Jesus uses this passage to explain why he speaks in parables. I still can't explain all of that, But he's saying, I'm going to a people who are committed to not believe, and I'm speaking in parables because of this strange and mixed rabble audience, some of whom are absolutely committed in their unbelief, and others of whom will receive. It comes up again in Acts chapter 28, and I love Paul. This is the end of the book, and it's the end of Paul's ministry. Listen, let me just read. You don't need to turn there, but in Acts 28, we've only got a half a page left of Acts, right? So we're at the end of Paul's recorded ministry for us, and it says this: after arranging a day with him, many people came to his lodging, and from dawn to dusk, he expounded and testified about the kingdom of God. This guy is a preacher and a missionary par excellence. He sees the calling, he sees the opportunity and the need, and every moment of his life, dawn to dusk, he's preaching the kingdom. And he tried to persuade them about Jesus from both the law of Moses and the prophets, and some were persuaded by what he said, but others did not believe. Disagreeing among themselves, they began to leave after Paul made one statement. Okay, how did he ruin it? What was the statement he made? And here's what Paul said. The Holy Spirit was right in saying to your ancestors through the prophet Isaiah when he said, go to this people and say, you will always be listening, but never understanding. You'll always be looking, but never perceiving. Paul saw it again. Paul saw that this pervasive and committed and almost universal unbelief all around him was something that had happened in the past. It's the condition of the human heart. I think Paul mentions it again, by the way. And we won't turn there, but in Romans chapter 1. In Romans chapter 1, there's this description of man in his moral and his ethical and his theological spiraling downward when he turns every evidence of God in creation around him into this bizarre story of idols and false gods. And he corrupts all of the evidence around him. And he's so committed to these various corruptions of the truth around him that the text tells us in chapter 1 of Romans, verses 24, 26, and 28, that God gives them over to the futility of their own thinking. Do you know what that means? As best I can tell, there comes a point in this committed, and I would say in some cases angry and defiant and rebellious unbelief. Would somebody get me a water? There's $5 in it. I think I just found out how to raise those missions dollars, Russell. I'm trying my best not to cough into this mic because I'll blow away 3 pews. Thank you. Great is your reward in heaven. I really don't have $5. Romans chapter 1, it's describing the judicial blindness. Now, I wish I could put all those pieces together, but here's what I think I understand. I think I understand that everybody has this opportunity, of course, to respond to the gospel. And all of the offers of the gospel are genuine and they're real in the New Testament, but there comes a time in committed and extended unbelief when God, in a judicial act on that heart, turns away from it. And the way Paul describes it in Romans 1 is that he gives them over. It is a judicial act on his part because he walks away. But he doesn't do anything to the heart that the heart hasn't already done. The heart has already run away from God and is disinterested and committed to reject God. And the heart runs away, and what God does, as I understand Romans 1, he just says, all right, you're on your own. You got it. You got your answers. You got your ride. You got your metaphysic. You have your epistemology. You have all of your answers. Go with it. You say, when does he do that? And my answer is yes, that's right. That's a good question. I don't know. So you know what I do? I share the gospel like somebody who has no idea when that's happened to anybody. I think it's the best I can do. The best I can do is to share the free offer of grace that is known in Christ without any knowledge of where they stand with God because I don't know. There comes a point, though, when some people are unable to believe. And you may have seen it. I don't know, but I think I've seen it in personalities that I've talked with. I had a conversation with a young man one time who, because he was so afraid when he saw that if there is a law, a moral law that brings with it moral duties and obligations, that there must be a lawgiver, which what this means is that some moral truth is absolute. Let me give you an example. to torture babies for personal gratification. There's no culture, there's no context, there's no moment when that can be seen as a virtue, right? And this young man I was talking to saw that he's quickly running headlong into moral absolutes. And so do you know what he was willing to do? He was willing to say, we can't say Hitler was wrong. We can only say that he was doing things that I don't approve of. Yeah. That's when I knew there was no more rational thinking now. This is digging your heels in because I'm getting caught by my own moral values. People come to a point, I believe, where they can't believe anymore because they have warped themselves for so long with a committed unbelief. But I don't know who that person is. I used to go to the jails on Sunday mornings for years. My wife and I went to the jails in Kansas City, Kansas. And some of the guys would call me over to the bars and say, I hear what you say, but what about this? And they'd give me some objection to the faith. I'd go with it. I'd say, well, here's what I understand. This is what I think, and let me give you my perspective on that. I had somebody pull me aside and say, you shouldn't do that because it's all smoke and mirrors. They're not being honest. And I'm thinking, how do you know that? Really? You're that good at intending or at judging the intents and the purposes of the heart? Never even met this guy. How can they know that? I don't do that. Jesus was really good at looking at the heart. I'm not. I don't do that. Somebody asks a question, I'm going with it. I'm answering it. I'll let God cash all that stuff out that he can do. That's not my job. More on that in just a moment. There was a refusal to believe. There was an inability in some cases to believe, and this was the Jews. The audience of Jesus, by the way, during this time of the signs was twofold at least. There were the Jews, and Jews often is sort of a catchphrase to refer to the religious leaders of the Jews, not just Jewish people, because Jewish people were believing. So the Jews usually refers to religious leaders, but there was also the world. The world does not love me. The world cannot accept me, Jesus said. He uses this word world just to refer to people in general, and they were not receiving the message. In some cases, they couldn't. There was certainly a refusal, but it's also a hardness to believe. Look at verse 42. Nevertheless, many did believe in him among the rulers. Wow. There were some of the religious rulers of the day who were actually being convinced by Jesus. But look what it says. But because of the Pharisees, they did not confess him so that they wouldn't be banned from the synagogue. Look at chapter 9. Remember the guy who had been healed from blindness. They excommunicated him. There's been an argument that excommunication came later in the history. Well, it may have come later in a more technical form, in a more codified form, but it was certainly happening in Jesus' day. These religious leaders came to Jesus, but they kept it quiet because they didn't want to be thrown out of the synagogue. It was their culture, it was their community, it was their life. There was fear because they loved human praise more than the praise of God. This is kind of interesting. Let's name a couple. Nicodemus, chapter 3, right? Jesus referred to him as the teacher of Israel. I mean, he had some kind of status as a teacher, as an expert. And there you see Jesus sharing the gospel with Nicodemus, but we know later that he became a believer, that he came to faith in Christ, but he's holding back. Joseph of Arimathea, maybe you've never heard of him before. Jesus ultimately would be buried in his tomb, which was given for the purpose of burying Jesus after his execution. But he's also identified as someone who came to faith but held it privately because he was afraid of what was going to go on. You know, the fact is, some people struggle to come to faith, and some people come to faith and struggle in it. Right? That's a common story. Because some people are struggling with light. You know, they're fighting against the arm of the Lord. You know, Lord, who's... the phrase in chapter 53, when he says, to whom has the arm of the Lord been revealed? That's that move of God to manifest himself among his people. And there are some people who fight against all of that light. They fight against the evidence. They fight against the historicity of the Gospels. They fight against anything that would present itself as evidence that this message is true. We know those people, and frankly, I like talking with them. It's an opportunity. Some people, though, just instead of struggling with light, they struggle with fear. They're fighting against the rejection that will come if they come to Christ. That's where Nicodemus and Joseph was. They eventually came out. It eventually became known, and I'm sure it was complicated for them. John chapter 5 says this, how can you believe since you accept glory from one another, but don't seek the glory that comes from the only God? Some people are struggling for a number of reasons to come to Christ, and the bottom line is that their struggle is a spiritual struggle. Great story. Got a great story. I've got time for it. When I was younger, I went to Belarus, the country of Belarus, a couple of times. Great experience. Belarus is just to the east of Poland and is in between, today we would say in between Poland and Russia. It used to be a part of the USSR. It's now one of the Confederated States. Many of you have heard of Minsk. Minsk is the capital of Belarus. And I went the year after the wall had come down and a little Bible college had begun to form. This is crazy. This was a crazy story. I mean, I can't even tell you how crazy this experience was. I went twice to teach there. This was to people who were not allowed to be taught the Bible before. So when the wall came down and this freedom was given with certain parameters on it, Campus Crusade crew went over and they started the International Leadership Academy, Reed Bible College. But, they didn't call it that. And they invited students. They had 55 students, and we would start at like 7:30 or 8 o'clock in the morning and go till 5:30 at night, and we'd stay another 2 hours for open Q&A. And this went for 3 weeks. It was an unbelievable experience. I had a translator. His name was Yuri Smirnov. Yuri was from the university, and he was selected to be a translator because he was a translator for 13 languages. And he was absolutely brilliant, one of the most brilliant guys I ever met before. He was a fun guy. I got to know him for, a long period of time up until his death. And I got to see the Lord change his heart. When I first met him, he had no discernible personality whatsoever. You know what I mean? Just straight. Everybody tells a joke and you just laugh. Well, it's funny because, yes, I understand. We're not going there. We're not laughing. We're not breaking down. There was no transparency. So Yuri's job, I hope I haven't told this story too many times. Yuri's job was to travel the Americans all over the country who were giving their testimony, and he would translate their testimony of salvation in front of 800,000, 1,100 people in a palace of culture, night after night after night. And then he'd go to my class at 8 o'clock in the morning, and he would translate theology until 5:30, 6:30, 7, 8 at night for 3 weeks. And then when I left, another pastor came, and he did the same thing all over again. When I left Belarus the first time, spent time with Yuri, he told me, you Americans, I don't believe any of this. We talked a little bit, and I felt a tug for Yuri, and I went home. I didn't know what was going to happen, but someone had told me that they found a copy of an apologetic work you're probably familiar with called Mere Christianity in Belarusian and gave it to Yuri. Yuri read it. And it had just the academic edge that would reach Yuri Smirnov because he was absolutely an academician. I don't know how long I'd been back from that trip, but I got a letter that I still have in my possession from Yuri, and he goes on and on about traveling with the Americans and hearing the testimonies and the time that he got to spend with me. And he said, but I'm writing this because I need to tell you something. This is powerful stuff. He said, when you are here, I'm going to give you the Yuri accent. He said, when you were here, I had many questions. He said, and the pastors would come over and they answered the questions the best they could. He said, it made me interested to read more. He said, so I read more, and I'm writing to tell you I became a believer. He said, I still have some of the questions I had before, but they don't matter anymore. Is that insane? Yeah, I hope you get to see one of those. Years after that, I get an unexpected text from his son who is struggling to find faith. And through talking on Facebook and some other people in his life, he came to faith now and is a witness, second generation down. Just amazing. I guess what I'm saying is it can be hard to believe. And there is this empirical, evidential thing going on, and that's a part of it, but there's more. There's more going on. There's much more going on in a soul that comes to saving faith than you lobbing a really well-crafted and worded argument across the bow. Final word on the Jews was that some believed and some didn't. Many struggled. Some came to faith. We'll come back to that in a moment. What's the final word from Jesus, though? Because in verse 44, Jesus gives what will be, I think, probably his last sermon before he sequesters to spend time with the disciples and to prepare them for his leaving. And so it's an interesting sermon because, we could refer to it as Jesus' last sermon, his last public sermon, it very well may be, before he was crucified. And so I'm wondering if I were to give my last sermon, what would that look like? And, Jesus, of course, it's an entirely different question. Well, in that light, it's really interesting that what Jesus does is he rehearses stuff he had been saying from the beginning of John 1. It's all the same themes. It's all the same issues. And I think what we take away is a list of things you need to know if you're going to respond to what Jesus said about himself. That's what these things are. Let's go through them. Well, let's read them a little bit at a time. Verse 44, Jesus cried out, "The one who believes in me believes not in me, but in him who sent me." What he's saying here is, look, if you believe me, you have to believe in God. This is the John chapter 5 equation. You know what the John chapter 5 equation is? If you honor the Father, well, then you have to honor the Son. If you want to honor the Son, you have to honor the Father. You cannot have one without the other. The Christian message is necessarily drawn up in the connection between Father and Son. Necessarily. And see, this is the problem that they had with Jesus. It wasn't the miracles. They didn't care that the guy could see again or that the guy could walk again. They didn't deny the miracles. What they denied is Jesus' claim to sonship. We'll find the same thing today, by the way. People are fine with Jesus being a worker of good deeds, but they're going to have trouble when Jesus claims to be the way, the truth, and the life, without whom no one comes to the Father. Second, in verses 44 and 45, let's read verse 45. "And the one who sees me sees him who sent me." This is going to be clarified a little bit more again in chapter 14. Disciples get a little bit tired of Jesus because they don't understand what he's saying all the time, and they ask for a real clear word. And what Jesus says to Philip addresses this issue. "Philip, if you've seen me, you have seen the Father." Again, Jesus is not going to let them escape this issue, and if you want to receive Jesus, become a Jesus follower, you're going to have to struggle with the connection of Father and Son and understand that Jesus was sent by the Father, that he represents the Father. He's going to flesh this out a little bit more in a moment. To believe in God is to believe that he sent Jesus into the world. And by the way, what was the thing that they kept getting stuck on? It was when Jesus said, "I was sent by my Father. I'm giving the words of the Father. I'm doing the Father's work." He had so many ways of saying it, that I am here on behalf of the Father. Verse 46, "I've come as a light into the world." Does that sound familiar? Chapter 1. Light has been a theme in John all the way through. He said, "I've come as a light into the world so that everyone who believes in me would not remain in darkness." So to receive Jesus is to receive him as the light, as the elimination of spiritual darkness. And look at verse 47. I think he clarifies. He says, "And if anyone hears my words and doesn't keep them, I don't judge him, because I didn't come into the world to judge the world." But he says there's a problem. So to really receive Jesus is to receive him as the answer to my spiritual need, as the light that dispels spiritual darkness. And to come to him also necessarily means to follow him. I can't just sign a line or get a nice laminated membership card. There's something more dynamic to following Jesus than just saying, "Okay, I can do that." That's not conversion. It's not just repeating a phrase. But it is to receive Jesus and recognize him as the light that dispels spiritual darkness, which talks about spiritual confusion, spiritual falsehood, spiritual misdirection. Jesus dispels it all. He is spiritual truth and spiritual direction and spiritual hope and light. He came to give us life that we might have it and have it more abundantly. Verse 48 and 50. "Now the one who rejects me and doesn't receive my sayings," my words, the things I've said, "has this as his judge. The word that I've spoken will judge him on the last day." This is kind of interesting, actually. "For I've not spoken on my own, but the Father himself who sent me has given me a command to say everything I've said." It seems to me that Jesus is getting even more explicit in his claim about representing the Father. Now he's saying, everything I've said has been at the command of the Father. I'm not free-forming. Jesus is trying to say that you can't receive me somehow in distinction from the Father, as though I'm on the earth doing my own thing and yet somehow committed to the Father. No, it's more than that. There's a dynamic connection between the person of the Father and the Son, so that Jesus can say everything I've said comes by way of express mandate from the Father. Verse 50, I know that his command is eternal life. So the things that I speak just as the Father has told me. So this section of verses 48 to 50, you see a couple of things. He says, first of all, my words will judge. Jesus distinguished his purpose from judgment, which is a little bit interesting, but I think we need to talk about for a second. He came to save. Jesus didn't come that first advent for the purpose of judging the world. But that does not mean that his words don't bring judgment. He said, the words that I speak will serve as judgment on people. I didn't come to judge you now, but my words will serve as judgment. I came to save. I came giving an invitation for people to receive eternal life. That's why I came. And I want people to receive eternal life. But if they reject the light, then what happens? My words become for them what? Become judgment. I think we're in a similar position, church, and I think it's helpful for us to think about it. What is my ministry? I want to be careful here, but we're in a similar position in a sense. There's a bit of parallelism because my purpose in the world is not to judge anybody. I think we need to hear that because I'm not always sure that Christians understand this. I think we would say we understand it, but I'm not sure we really understand it all. My job is not to judge people who come to me and tell me about their lifestyle. There are so many reasons why that's not my job. We could just go on and on. But it's interesting that though it is the capacity and it is the calling of the Son to judge unbelief, he didn't come that first advent for the purpose of judging people. So what was his purpose? His purpose was to invite them with the truth to the truth. And that's our purpose. Wouldn't it be interesting if we thought about every conversation we've had evangelistically and put it through this filter of, was I being judgmental or did I come across judgmental? And here's one of the reasons I say that. Because unbelievers largely will say to us that they're frustrated at the way believers comport themselves because they come across as being judgmental. Now, I understand that just the very words we use can sound judgmental, but it's also possible at times that we sound like it's our job to judge. It's not my job to judge. And I know it from some of the questions I get as a pastor. So I know a guy, and here's what he did in his life, and here's how long he did it, and here's the circumstances. So pastor, tell me, is he really a believer? No, don't do that to me. I can't answer that question. I mean, I can say, well, here's what Scripture says and some things this person might want to be concerned about and some things that you might, ask this person. But I don't know the heart of anybody. I get the question, about, and this comes up a lot, about homosexuality. So can that guy really be a believer if he says this or if he's done that? Again, I have some concerns, and they're biblically informed, and I think we can talk about those. But I'm not in a position to make the call. I don't make the call about anybody. God is really good at what he does, and I am not him. And neither are you. And if we're not careful, we'll come across as though, I know Jesus didn't come to judge, but I can get a little bit of that in. And I think people maybe accidentally hear us say that, even when we haven't. Isn't it possible to take the gospel and leave it with people who need it as a light to do whatever work it's going to do in their hearts, without me donning the robes of deity and taking an end times station that is never for me anyway? The words I've spoken, he says, my words will judge. Our purpose is not judgment, neither was his. And then he says in verse 49 to 50, he says, my words are the Father's. And his language is just so clear here. I've not spoken on my own. Everything I've spoken is from the Father. The things I speak are the things this Father has said. Has anybody watched the series on Netflix called Messiah? I found it. It's going places. Yeah, nobody has seen it. Well, I watched it because I thought you would. That's the only reason I'm watching this thing. But now I'm sucked in. I got curious, I watched the first one, and now, as they intend, I'm hopelessly stuck to the series, wasting my time because this thing is going absolutely nowhere. It positions a modern time Messiah personality who looks like every quintessential picture you've ever seen of Jesus, But they position him as possibly the Messiah of Judaism and of Christianity and al-Masih of Islam. And they wonder what it would look like today if he came on the scene. And so I've read a number of reviews. Now I'm up to, I don't know, I've watched 6 or so episodes. And all of the reviews say this thing is going nowhere, and I've concluded that the reviewers were perceptive. It doesn't seem to be going anywhere. But it's interesting to see them make a Messiah figure and how they flesh all of that. One of the things that I see in him that they get wrong is that he seems committed to the Father and to represent the Father in some way, but to not really know what the Father is doing and be a little bit confused about the future. And Jesus is saying that's not what's going on here. What's going on here is that the words I speak are exactly the words of the Father, and I represent him perfectly in what I say and in everything that I say. So, the final words from Jesus is that my message has been that if you believe me, you believe God, and if you believe God, you're believing me. That's what the response of conversion entails. He's saying, if you receive me, you receive me as one who's sent from God. If you receive me, you receive me as the light of the world who dispels the darkness. If you receive me, he says, you receive me as the one who has spoken the words of God. A few thoughts about signs as we kind of close up the book of signs and move on to the book of glory, as it's sometimes called, starting in chapter 13. First of all, signs are pointers, and they point to Jesus. That was the purpose of the signs. They were a means, not an end. Sometimes people talk about miracles today as though they were an end in themselves, and they weren't. They were never to be considered or thought about apart from the person of Jesus and his message and his life and his gospel. They were attendant realities to the gospel itself and to Jesus' message about the kingdom. Secondly, these signs elicit wonder when they're accompanied by openness, but when they're met with rejection, they very often instead harden a running heart. And I think that's what gets us sometimes. We see people who don't respond the same way to the gospel and to all that they see as Uri did. You think, man, if somebody like Uri is finally impacted by the gospel, why isn't it working on this guy? And that frustrates us. Signs do not always convince. They didn't always convince the Jews. They didn't always convince the world that Jesus spoke of. But unbelief might acknowledge signs even while it rejects Jesus' sonship, and that's what was going on. There are people who want to give a head nod to Jesus as some kind of undefinable, mystical personality from the past who points the way to something heavenly, or something amorphous and vague like that. But they don't want to accept Jesus in full sonship and with his full claims to be sent from and to represent perfectly the Father. Signs do contribute to a faith process, but much more is taking place than just their consideration of historical events and signs. Finally, Jesus left the public largely in disbelief. We're going to move on. He's going to leave the public. He spent all of his time, maybe a couple years, working signs, miracles. We don't even have them all written down. Arguing and debating and defending, asserting, claiming, demonstrating. But he left the crowds generally in unbelief. But that doesn't mean that they're going to stay there. In a very short amount of time, Jerusalem is going to be crawling with believers after the ultimate sign is manifest, and that is the resurrection of Jesus. So you have these people that you're sharing Christ with, and they're just not responding at all. Don't conclude much from that, because you're not in a good position. We got the cheap seats. We don't know what's going on in any heart. You're guessing. You tell me what's going on in your friend's heart, you know what my response is going to be? I might be a little rude. I'm going to say, you're guessing. Do you know why I'm saying that? Let's see. Because you're guessing. You can't know what's going on in somebody's heart. Don't try to connect the dots. Just be faithful with the message. Isaiah said, Lord, how long is it going to be like this? And he said, well, all of your ministry. But of course, God's periphery is a little broader than Isaiah's. And who knows, you may be serving with your presentation of the gospel a generation you won't even see. Just be faithful. I'm thankful for Uri's son coming to faith. Didn't see that coming. Didn't see it coming. And we can't see what's coming down the road either. Let's just be faithful. There are people out there who just refuse to believe. There are people who can't believe because of their consistent and regular rebellion against the truth. And then there are some people who are struggling and find it hard to believe, and God's going to use you if you just present the truth in the outworking of His grace that is beyond our ability to cash out and understand.